civilization against barbarism, freedom against oppression, progression against retrogression, the United States against Spain. In 1898, the United States embarked on a war with a humanitarian mission to liberate the Cubans who had been enduring a bloody struggle for independence against the tyranny of Spain for more than a decade. Even though the conflict began as a humanitarian mission, the compromise that resolved this war was pivotal in closing off the Western Hemisphere from European colonization and launched a new era of American prestige and power. The Spanish-American War of 1898, the rise of a superpower. After the Civil War, in the late 19th century, the American economy progressed rapidly due to the Second Industrial Revolution and was growing to become one of the greatest economies in the world. While European superpowers were rapidly practicing ruthless imperialism and colonization expansion all over the world, the American nation experienced an increasing influence of social Darwinism that led to the belief that the United States was inherently responsible for bringing concepts such as industry, freedom, democracy, and Christianity to less developed, savage societies, and in turn gain influence into their political, social, military, and economic control that would help America become an influential nation on the world's economic and political stage. In one such effort to gain influence in the economy of other countries, in the late 1880s, the United States started investing millions into Cuba's sugar plantation industry. At the time, Cuba was under the control of Spain politically, but Cuba started to depend on the United States economically. In 1895, the Cuban independence movement re-emerged against Spain after several failed rebellions, because Cuban rebels were hopeful that the United States would aid them in their revolution. However, the United States did not directly support the revolution. Instead, the U.S. President Grover Cleveland sent an ultimatum to Spain, demanding freedom reforms for Cuba. This ultimatum was ignored by Spain, and in 1896, the Spanish sent General Valerino Weyler, known as the Butcher, to Cuba to put down the insurgents. Weyler built concentration camps, in which he imprisoned a large portion of the Cuban population. Under the harsh and unsanitary conditions in the concentration camps, 300,000 Cuban prisoners died from famine and disease. In order to boost their sales, the yellow press in America reported gory stories to sensationalize the situation in Cuba and help strengthen anti-Spanish sentiment in the United States. In 1897, when U.S. President William McKinley was inaugurated, McKinley was cautious about brewing public sentiments about going to war with Spain. In January 1898, the Americans sent a ship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor to protect Cuba should there be any need for intervention.
The American people and the government, they were concerned about what was happening to the Cubans. They saw the Cubans as the underdogs and the good guys. Now, there's more to it than that. There's also an economic rationale in that American businessmen wanted to protect their sugar plantations down in Cuba.
After only a few days of it being peacefully docked, the Maine exploded, killing 266 American sailors. Although there was no proof in the Spanish having any hand in demolishing the Maine, the American yellow press was quick to spread conspiracies, claiming that the Spanish were the ones who had orchestrated this attack. The American public grew furious, and pro-war sentiments became popular in the U.S. However, although the United States government was angered, they were still reluctant to go to war in order to avoid the disasters and expenses. Soon after, a Spanish minister insulted McKinley in the Delome letter by calling him a weak politician, which fueled much anger against Spain. And on March 29, 1898, as a last resort, the United States government issued yet another ultimatum to the Spanish government to terminate its presence in Cuba, hoping that this time, Spain would accept and they could avoid conflict. Spain did not accept the ultimatum. McKinley was desolate that their non-violent attempts at resolving this conflict were ineffective, and he began to realize that the best way to resolve would be to employ force. On April 25th, war was formally declared by the United States against Spain, with "Remember the Maine" becoming a popular rallying battle cry for Americans. On May 1st, the first battle of the Spanish-American War ensued. The Battle of Manila Bay was a naval battle in the Philippines, which was then Spanish territory. There was an American victory. 10 days later, on May 11th, the U.S. attacked Cardenas Harbor in Cuba, a spot where the Spanish military had stationed many troops. In this battle, the Spanish emerged victorious. Disheartened by this loss, Theodore Roosevelt, who was then the Assistant Secretary of the Army, began creating an Army regiment called the Rough Riders. They would soon achieve fame by playing a pivotal role in this war. On June 21st, the United States captured the island of Guam, which was then Spanish territory. On July 1st, Roosevelt's Rough Riders performed spectacularly in the battles of El Caney and San Juan Hill, which resulted in American victories. The next battle was a cornerstone in this war. On July 3rd, the Battle of Santiago resulted in the United States completely destroying the Spanish Navy. And after the United States successfully invaded Puerto Rico and triumphed in the battles of Puerto Rico and Coamo, Spain was beginning to seriously consider proposing peace. And on July 26, 1898, it proposed a temporary ceasefire with the United States, which was put into place. However, this did not officially end conflict, because both the countries still had very hostile relations with each other, and some skirmishes occurred. Neither side was willing to completely surrender, so negotiations for a compromise went underway. Spain and the United States met to finalize the talks for the Treaty of Paris of 1898, and it was finally signed by the United States of America and Spain on December 10, 1898, for a compromise to end the Spanish-American War. The main conditions that were laid out in the Treaty of Paris were: the Spanish would cede Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and Spain would proceed to evacuate these islands. Spain would cede the Philippines to the United States upon payment of $20 million. Spain would abdicate its sovereignty in Cuba, but would reserve the rights to keep the lands that were acquired before the treaty. United States and Spanish ships would be treated with the same opportunity and respect in the ports of Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. The United States would send back all Spanish prisoners of war with their own expenses. Spain would release all U.S. prisoners of war and detainees. An effective compromise must be beneficial to all parties involved. This compromise was beneficial to both Spain and the United States because, with the newly acquired territories, the U.S. expanded their trade markets and political territories all across the globe. Spain was also benefited in this war because the $20 million was a useful asset to invest in recovering from the war. Spain was also given trade opportunities with its former territories, so it had many economic opportunities. Spain was liberated from the shackles of imperialistic ideals and was allowed to develop its cultural impact on its future. The compromise that resolved this war was the catalyst for a movement of regeneration in Spanish politics, arts, and sciences. The Cubans were also benefited because Cuba was able to flourish as an independent nation.
We did practice a form of imperialism going back here to 1898 onward. We kept Cuba in check and under our influence without really occupying it. We had the naval base at Guantanamo, but we controlled it economically. You control that country's economy, and therefore you have a huge control over its political system too.
The compromise that resolved the conflict of the Spanish-American War had a long-lasting impact on the world's history today. Most importantly, the U.S.'s new territories allowed them to be respected as a political equal by European superpowers and allowed them to expand their markets and economy significantly to become the superpower country that it is today. America went on to influence political and economic policies across the world later. The Spanish-American War also shaped an important part of the American identity. Since then, the American nation has been a strong advocate of restoring freedom and democracy and to aid many nations to fight against atrocities of dictatorial powers, both internal and external. In this cause, the flag of freedom unfurled many times in the face of a foreign foe, and our nation entered war against the people of another land, carrying the Star-Spangled Banner through successive victories in the name of liberty and humanity.